Both Emily and Steven said they were going to be late, so we're going to give them time.
Should we get started?
Sure.
It's 10 past.
Yeah, should we do all the, please sign into the doc, new faces? Easy today.
Yeah, sign in the doc. I recognize all these faces, so I don't think there are any new.
All right. You ready to talk about Stackpacks? Let's make all the decisions before Stephen gets here.
I thought that was the plan.
I
That's
assume
why
that's
you're
why we were
keeping-
waiting, because I feel like we keep making decisions without everyone there, and then they just go around in circles.
Do we just need to
feel-
schedule a meeting where Steven can show up on time?
This is that one, supposedly.
Like-
it is a full-time job keeping Emily and Stephen happy at the same time. It's really difficult. I'll get advice from Emily and then do that. And then I ask Stephen to look at it and he's like, oh, why would you do that? And vice versa, by the way.
I feel like we just need to argue with each other up front and then come talk to you is probably the better way to do it.
I feel like that's what we used to do, right? Is that you would go off in somewhere and then you'd come back with a unified response
decision.
after. Yeah.
It was before Steven got too
Well-
busy. Now it's Steven be like, whatever you say, I'll agree with, but then it doesn't turn out to be
But he doesn't
true.
actually.
Or like right away, it doesn't turn out to be true. I feel like he could be talked into a lot of it, but it's still a process.
I think some of the things we'll talk about today, the challenge is that this, for me, just I don't want to copy paste a lot of code. Just want to structure it so that it's, like if we're reading the platform directory or whatever, we're doing it once the same way. But then the other part of, and that part's easy because whatever, we'll figure that out. But the other part that might be challenging is, I think, like certainly for me, as I'm working on the implementation for the Stackpacks, I want to err on the side of just do it like a normal build pack for as much as I can. Basically every decision, that's where I start. But I think that's not, my impression is that's not where Steven's starting. And he's thinking much more of it as like, like from first principles, like as an independent concept. So when it comes to like launch TOML, we're not quite seeing eye to eye for that reason. That's
Is there
just for context. Yeah.
I guess, what are the things, I guess backing up in case people actually watch this recording, what is the topic and what are we hoping to kind of get done in this, I guess?
Yeah, it's a good
47 minutes?
question. Are we trying to get the RFC to the point where everybody agrees on it, or are we going to talk through some of the code in the POC? Because I think that's been the point of contention more than anything. I mean, there's some minor stuff in the RFC that we need to sort out, but it feels
Maybe we
cosmetic.
can make a list of outstanding questions and then prioritize the ones that block the RFC. And then
Yeah,
on to
let's
the
do
ones
that.
after that.
I'm just gonna do it in the working group doc here.
Sounds good.
So, yeah. I assume Emily
So
had
the
an
first
idea
one I
since
think
she
is-
suggested this.
Yeah, so the first one is, I think, stack TOML. It's both its name and its like structure, or if it's its own thing. So in the RFC, stack TOML is kind of like an analog to launch TOML. And it serves two purposes. One is to define directories and files that are always restored, even if the base image changes. So an example would be the package indices for like apt or whatever. And then the other thing it does is exclude things from the launch or the launch image. So you might have like, var cache or whatever. So Stephen, I'm not married to my proposal, but I think he wants to change some things with it.
I think that was one big question. There's also a question about life cycle phases. Is it its own phase or separate phases, right?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of facets to that. It's like, there's builder, there could be like a builder phase, which does two things. Or there could be like, I don't know what to call it, like two binaries, like root builder plus builder. Like one of the proposals Stephen had was the phase actually executes two binaries, which feels like it's kind of a sucky contract between the platform and the life cycle. But I mean, I guess it's easy to opt out of Stackpacks that way. The other was like extender calls builder. So you still have two binaries. One is like root builder, but it handles the Stackpacks, but then it actually calls out to another binary, which would be just builder. And so the way you would opt out of Stackpacks is by not calling the extender builder. I'm gonna call that extender builder.
I think there's also something about phase specific mix-ins that was a sticking point. And I know Stephen wanted to sort that out before merging the RFC, right?
Phase specific mix-ins?
Like the build and run prefixes on the mix-ins,
Well,
which there's
isn't
now
that his
another RFC for him, but I think he cared about answering that question before we started pulling the root builder stuff in, right?
I kind of thought his RFC made that all just work, but maybe I'm wrong.
I had some things I wanted to change about that, but I could accept it as a compromise that unblocks us and then talk about bigger questions later.
Do you know if he's coming to this meeting, but just late, or if he's just double booked?
He said he was coming late and that for reals, he was only going to be 15 minutes late.
Okay. It's like his 30 minutes late to leadership meeting.
Yeah. He's now 17 minutes late, so any minute now.
Okay.
The other things are some of the finer points. I'll just call it finer points of Stackpacks.
There's some questions like, what's the working directory if there's no app?
Yeah, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, because I think the RFC was saying that the contract would essentially have all the same parts, but I'm not sure they actually all make sense in this context.
Mm-hmm.
Still could be the app directory. It could just be empty, right? You could just give it an empty mount or something, just to keep things simple.
Yep. I was doing slash just because well, actually, no, that's not true. I was gonna say because it felt like that's what would be expected, but maybe like home/root or something is more like what's expected. I don't know. I really don't know. Can they modify the BOM? Can they add layers? Can they make slices? Can they create?
I think that one's easy, and the answer is no, because if they can't see the app, they can't possibly make slices.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it would be like, can they like we would have to redefine slices. Like, could they put each?
Oh, can they
could they put
slice
things
their
under
layers?
user lib? Yeah, right. Could they put stuff under user lib into different layers? I'm inclined to say no, but
at least for now, that'd be an easy additive change to make, not something we have to decide up front, right?
Yeah. So we'll just say no. Can they create process types? Again, very similar to slices, like easy to add later. Don't really have a use case yet, but I can totally imagine it. On the other hand, like understanding if we want to go that direction with these things, I think relates to the question about stack toml and launch toml. Like if we think there's a future where they can create slices, process types, modify the BOM, well, that one's a little bit different. But that would like lead us towards a single toml file that comes out of the build process, whether it's a Stackpack or regular Buildpack.
So should we dive into the stack toml question then?
Sure. Do you have I think I know where, maybe you know where Steven stands on it. What do you think?
My hot take is that it should just use launch toml instead of having a separate file. And it could have its own section that's specific to this type of build pack where it puts things, and we can say some things are not allowed in this context for now, but it'd make it easy to incorporate other features later.
Yeah, me too. The only problem is launch as a name feels too narrowly scoped in that case. And maybe that like...
Why?
Because some of the things, one of the things doesn't have anything to do with launch, and that is the list of restored directories. So the app package indices, basically, they have nothing to do with launch. And you need a place to define those.
We now, with one of the other RFCs we approved, have a launch toml and a build toml. Maybe some of these things belong in launch, other ones belong in build.
I forgot about build toml. That makes sense. But yeah, I just created that so I could move forward the stack toml. I definitely like or prefer like trying to use launch toml or build toml.
I also had one more question, which was in buildpack.toml. We were using privileged Boolean to decide whether this was a stack pack or a regular build pack. And I was wondering if instead of doing that, we wanted to have something more like, I think the fact that Stackpacks have to be privileged feels more like a requirement or implementation detail than it feels like it's the point of the Stackpacks. In some ways, the point of the Stackpacks is that it's making only ABI compatible changes. That's the real big material difference from a user's perspective. I was wondering if we wanted to say something like scope equals stack versus scope app. To make this distinction, because then later we could have privileged still be a Boolean if we wanted other types of privileged build packs. We haven't taken this as the key for Stackpacks in particular. Like, I'm not sure we'll ever do that, but we could make our lives, we could leave that open as an option just in case, because I know we've discussed it in the past.
Yeah, I don't have a strong feeling. I kind of was using privileged as a placeholder until I figured it out, and then everybody just seemed to be okay with it, so I kept using it, but I don't care.
I like the scoping thing that Emily suggested. Privilege always rubbed me a little bit the wrong way, mostly because of I guess the origin where Stackpacks came from, of like, we want to probably back out to root Buildpacks eventually, right? As a feature down the line where it is a non-ABI compatible change, but that's like a totally separate mechanism and probably want to discourage its use except for very finite use cases, if it ever comes down to that.
I feel like it also implies to users, like, if they want to do something in their build pack, but they can't because they're not root, they're like, oh, I'll just make it a privileged build pack, but that's really not. It's a slightly different concept than that, and this might be more explicit.
Yeah, and privilege is I guess, like, we always talk about the Dockerisms. Privilege is a very specific Dockerism thing. That means a specific thing. So I think that makes sense. Welcome, Stephen.
Hey, sorry. At least I actually showed up this time. I don't want to interrupt if you're deep in talking about particular.
No, you're a good time. I'm +1 on scope.
Yeah. We put we just started to catch you up, listening kind of the open questions and things we wanted to talk about in the meeting today. I know there's a bunch of stuff that you probably have opinions and input on.
There were two really specific things. One was a code or like an architecture thing about how we run the builder and how much we share between root build packs and non-root build packs. And the other was mix-ins. If we talk about those two things at some point, then I'd be very happy.
We have both of those questions on our list, which we put in the docs. We have lifecycle phases, which I think is getting at the architecture thing you're talking about.
Yep, exactly.
And phase-specific mix-ins.
Awesome.
Other than scope, moving from privilege to scope, the other thing we discussed briefly was stack TOML versus reusing launch and build TOML with special keys for Stackpacks. Do you have an opinion on that?
Sorry, moving from what to what with special keys for what?
The Stackpacks need the...
So the stack TOML in my POC, which I think you saw, does two things. It defines the files and directories that will be restored even if there's a new base image, so like app package indices.
Yep.
And then it also defines files and directories that will be excluded from the launch image, like var cache or whatever, but that you want to keep for performance reasons. So stack TOML is probably not the right place for those. I just did that so I could move forward. So we were talking about putting the excludes in launch TOML and the restores in build TOML.
Excludes, so I remember there's one caching mechanism where you say, this is a chunk of stuff that I don't want to go into the image, right? Like you can exclude something.
Launch image.
The launch image. And then you can also pass a cache flag to say also for that stuff, bring it back on the next build, right? Which of those things we just talked about is that mechanism?
Wait, I didn't understand the last part. So the excludes has the paths and then cache Boolean.
Got it. So excludes is that. And then what's the other thing? That's I guess
restores is the package indices for like that's only for build time where you don't want a new base image to invalidate your cache.
Doesn't the excludes with the path and the cache achieve the same thing?
I'm not sure we can make that assumption.
Because it's like, that's how I imagine, or that's why I thought we were adding a cache to the excludes. So you can say like, here are the apt indices, right?
Yeah, is that true? I mean, is that going to be true though? I'm just not sure I know enough about the use cases to say that unequivocally. Like, it definitely seems like there are times where those will be the same paths.
What's the case where it's like if you wanted to put something in the image and you wanted to restore it or something? It's the case that's, but then you'll start on that top of that image next time anyways, right? If you can restore it. I thought we just had one caching mechanism. It was like, here's a chunk of, in either image, here's a chunk of stuff that I don't want it to make into the final image. You can just exclude it completely because it's temp files, or you can make sure that it comes back on the next, well, like, and you can make sure that it comes back to the next build optionally, right? And so for the app packages, you say, I don't want this in the image because you don't want your run image to have the apt index, and you want it to come back in the next build. So you do exclude paths equals var apt something, and then cache equals true, and then I think you're golden in both images.
In some ways, what we're talking about is kind of like slices, right? If you have a diff that your Buildpack created, and then you use these paths to slice it, then you have multiple layers. And you could think of it as analogous to how we have cache, launch, and build for normal layers, except that build doesn't make sense for Stackpacks because there's no explicit exposing. And whether it's launch true or false, I think isn't something the Buildpack decides, because if it was created while running on the run image, it's launch true. And if it was created while running on the build image, it's launch false. So the only Boolean we have left that we care about is cache.
That makes sense to me. I'm still confused about what the other list is, though. Or like, I just don't know what the other.
Yeah.
I didn't see that other thing that was proposed.
No, I mean, the reason there's two lists is that I wasn't confident that we would be able to capture all the things with a single list. And it sounds like we can.
I think we may need to indicate when we store these things in the cache, what, I guess whether it's launch true or build true, which are mutually exclusive in this case, and the build pack wouldn't be actively deciding what to do with those, it'd be based on the context, but we need to know so we know which image to restore it to later, right? Like we basically need a restore on the run image. Like we can cache build image changes and we can cache run image changes. We need to know the difference between them.
Yeah. On the looking through the RFC, where I see at the very bottom you have stack toml and build.restores and run.excludes, and I think it looks like the idea was to split the runtime version of that with the build time version.
Mm-hmm.
But then a while ago there was like 3 or 4 working group meetings ago we talked about we actually need the caching on the build time image also, because you're not guaranteed to come back on the previous version of the image at build time because your upstream base image can change, which I think flattens those into the same API for both images. Maybe that I forgot to leave that as a comment on the thing, and so you didn't update it. Does that seem like it's right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Cool. Emily, I didn't completely understand the restore thing. I don't know if that covers it though, or
It depends whether that covers it. Like, I don't know exactly what. It'd be nice to like see a concrete example of the file written up, so then I know whether like, oh yes, it's enough information to do exactly what we need to do. You know what I mean? I feel like we always get to this level of detail where we mostly all agree on what we need, but it's hard to get all the way across the finish line without like typing an example.
Yeah, maybe as I start to flesh this out in the code, there'll be some unit tests that help illustrate it. I don't know if that's real enough, but I think they'll be pretty contrived, but maybe if we replace those with like real directories that make sense in the context of like apt or whatever, that'll help.
I think because this one feature is uniquely complicated, that our proof of concept is going to keep feeding back on the RFC for changes. I guess there's like a meta question of how we want to handle that. Do we just want to keep this open for a while and keep working on it and edit it, or do we want to get something through and know that very quickly we'll have another RFC that's like superseding?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think at this point we could probably say stuff goes in launch toml, which will be defined in a separate RFC. And then as I'm working through the POC, we can, or I can write the RFC for the launch toml changes. Does that, and then that we can go into much more detail there than, like if we start doing that in the app mixins RFC, it feels like that's gonna get really big.
So you're gonna, just help me understand, you're gonna move stack toml to launch toml is the idea, and where does launch toml live, and how's it different than having stack toml with an excludes and paths and cache?
So I'm not 100% sure, but like launch toml would go in the same place it always goes, the layers directory.
But we can't have a layers directory for the stack pack within /layers because it's going to run as root and all that stuff.
No, I think we should.
Well, I guess why can't we have the directory?
I don't know if we want to do we want to have some layers and /layers as root owned and others as
No, it
not
can't create
root-owned?
layers. It can't create layers, but we will pass it that directory to which it can write files. Like one of the cases that I was thinking of, and this is because like one of the build packs I was using did this, it was just like setting up some files and directories in the layers directory, because that's just what it did. And then my builder just ignored it because it was a stack pack. And I feel like that's actually a real case we should consider. I'm not married to one behavior or the other, but I kind of favor like, yeah, just let it write stuff in there and ignore it. Like if like you can imagine if you're using like lib-buildpack and it initializes some file or thing, like even if it's just like as a sandbox, just let it do that. Don't error out.
So you just mean by a layers directory, you just mean there's a directory that it's dedicated to the build pack.
Yes.
The build pack used to store configuration and communicate that to the lifecycle. That makes a lot of sense. I think calling it a layers directory word.
Sure. And
That is
maybe
what we
should
call it, though, in the
That is
Buildpack
what we call it.
API, right? It's the
Yeah.
Buildpacks layers directory. And that's the one that's like /layers and then
But-
Buildpack ID. And then underneath that, there's the layers directory.
I actually think layers directory is a misnomer. Like the layers directory is actually, well, it's like the layers directories, which are probably in the like Buildpacks sandbox directory or whatever we call it. Like that's where launch toml goes. It's not really a layers, you know.
There are three
Well-
different things we call layers directory. One of them is
Yeah.
/layers. Then in the Buildpack API, we call /layers /Buildpack ID the layers directory. And then when we talk about a layer, we call /layers Buildpack ID layer name the layer directory.
I think we're in agreement that there should be a directory dedicated to the stack pack that the stack pack can use to communicate configuration to the platform. It's not used to preserve bits that go into the image and into the final image.
I think it should live under /layers /Buildpack ID. I think it's just easier because we have a single volume. And we never just iterate over that blindly. We always use the group to figure out what we want to read out of there. And that would be similar. We just use the stack group to figure out what we want to read out of there.
I don't have a strong opinion. We can move on. I have issues about accidentally preserving that directory in the future, but like I'm happy to compromise that. We can talk.
I think we should probably rename it. I think it should be the same directory, but I don't think it should be called layers.
Each of the build packs layers directories, like the layer for the directory for each build pack for which the build pack puts layers in contains directories that get turned into layers. The only thing that's in that top level /layers, the only thing that's not layers is some configuration files that sit around layers. So if we didn't want to store other things,
we put a bunch of
layers,
other random files in there too because it's convenient.
We stop doing that.
But then we need another place to put them, and we don't want another volume. In some ways, layers should have been a subspace underneath what should have been the workspace, and then the app is the app.
I can see that. Let's.
Yeah, just for time.
Okay, I think
we have
we're
like
in
20
general
minutes
agreement.
left.
Yeah.
Good. Let's talk about the lifecycle phases, because I think this is important to my POC, at least moving it forward. The way I have it structured now is that there's one builder binary, and also the like sort of the library part of it, which is like builder.go at the top level. And they're all the same thing. There's the same entry point. It just accepts a group toml and a stack group toml, the binary does. And then it runs the library part of the builder twice, once for the stack packs and then once for the regular build packs. I'm completely open to changing this. I'm just trying to find, ways to not copy and paste a bunch of code, including tests. But I think so. Stephen had proposed splitting it out into two builders, a root builder and a builder, but they would have to run in the same container in the same phase. So that would require the platform to know that it has to run both of them, which is a little bit weird as a contract. But
actually, it's not exactly that. Can I give a little bit of motivation and then talk about what
I like set some rules for the discussion or a principle I would like to propose?
Sure.
Which is, I think some of these conversations have been driven by not wanting to repeat a lot of code. But I think there are many ways to avoid repeating a lot of code. And I'd like to start just by framing the conversation around what interface we want, and then we can talk about how to not repeat code while doing that.
I agree completely. I'm separate, not related to repeating code. I'm worried about having the builder logic, right? The thing that runs unprivileged in the container runs through normal build packs. Like as we extend that, I worry about applying the same logic on the run image during build time when you're extending the run image and just running Stackpacks, or like in all these other cases. I feel like it's sort of built to do this, you know, running normal build packs in a row thing, you know, against that contract, right? And it's nice that you can, you know, always run it as an unprivileged user and expect it to, you know, write all the files with the right permissions, you know, all that. So what I propose is have another binary that's the Stackpack binary that runs privileged, right? That during the build phase runs the Stackpacks with the Stackpack contract first, and then it actually executes the unprivileged builder as a normal user and does the rest of the build packs using the normal builder logic. If a platform doesn't want to support Stackpacks and wants to do a maximally secure configuration where the build image always runs unprivileged, like Kpack, it could just execute the builder and not execute the root builder. But if there are Stackpacks, the platform can execute the root builder, which executes the root buildbacks and then executes the builder. Then on the run image, you could have either a flag to that privileged binary or a different binary that does the extension of the run image, running the Stackpacks on the run image. And that's the, without talking about the code, that's the high level kind of like architecture that I think would feels most secure and keeps the best separation between.
Yeah,
I don't know why we have to have two binaries to achieve all those things you just laid out, Stephen. Like if
I was gonna say that's like what I'm doing right now is exactly what you described in a single binary. Like instead of exiting or calling out from one binary to another, it's just happening in the same binary where it switches users.
it drops the privileges, just like we do when we run creator. So you could either run builder not as root, in which case if you passed it stack build packs, it'd be like, no, sorry,
Yep.
I can't do that. Or you run it as root and it does the stack build packs and then drops privileges and then does its normal thing.
There are a couple things that make me worried about that. One is this is when untrusted code executes, right? The way we've kind of figured out how to drop privileges in a Go binary with a degree of reliability, but it's very easy to, like in the first couple iterations, for instance, not drop privileges in all threads and have stuff that's secretly still running as root, right?
We fixed that though.
we did, but it's not a simple thing to do, right? It feels, I'm not super strongly opinionated. If there's still a way to run this one builder, right, as a normal user, and then have it skip the Stackpacks, and then run the normal builder logic, I think I'm okay with that. But it feels simpler if, in the case where you're not using Stackpacks, the platform can execute something that's just the normal build pack runner and not have to worry about what that logic looks like.
I feel like in the case where you're not using Stackpacks, that is exactly what you would do. You'd execute the normal builder as a normal user, and you get the same behavior you get now. Absolutely nothing changes. It's just
so the
only thing that changes is the Stackpack example.
Yeah, like the builder binary that I have in my prototype, like if you pass it the stack group toml, it checks to make sure that it's privileged, and if you don't, it doesn't. Or actually, I think it's the inverse. It's like it checks to make sure it's not privileged if you don't give it the stack group toml. So like you can run that same binary with or without privileges. I feel like the separation you're describing, Stephen, feels like a what do you call it? Not like a security thing, but like a trust thing, and that like this ensures that we will not accidentally run something as root that you didn't mean to. But I feel like we could still do that by accident. like even if we have two separate binaries.
Yeah, it's definitely. Terrence has a comment too. I appreciate the support.
I don't feel strongly either way.
I don't feel super strongly about. Well, I think I lean towards liking the process separation, right, and keeping the whole builder binary as strictly, even just for internal factoring reasons, sort of strictly separate from the thing that runs Stackpacks, so platforms can choose to never have to deal with that code path if they want to. But I could, I'm not going to block the PR on it as long as the internal factoring of the builder itself is, similar enough to that thing. If we feel strongly that we can really guarantee that the lifecycle can always adequately drop privileges on all threads, and then we're not going to, and also that this is not going to cause a problem on Windows.
What's the reason we have to, in both scenarios, it's sort of assumed that it's either a process and then a child process. Why can't it be a separate phase? I guess I'm missing where the
the separate phase would require a separate container, and then you would lose. There would be no way to carry forward the changes that you made to the image during the Stackpacks phase, unless you also gave privileges to the next phase. So you'd be in trouble there. You know what I'm saying? Like if you wrote something to like user bin, you would also need to write that in the unprivileged builder phase, but you can't because you don't have privileges.
We're trying to avoid dynamically writing an image and then loading the image in the next stage, right?
Okay, that's what I was saying. Okay,
I like having a single binary entry point. The part where I care about the separation is the last time I looked at the proof of concept, it was running a single build method that could do either type of build pack. And I actually want those things to be separated at the library level, even though they have the same entry
that's
point.
fine. That was more like, it was just really easy to do it that way because there's like 2 lines different, or maybe a little bit more than that, but like how it loops over the build packs and how it sets up the CMD to exec it and all that was exactly the same. So like you said, there's other ways to accomplish
what I don't want is if someone put privilege true in their build pack toml and then put it in a group,
right,
that we would get any of this behavior. I feel like if it's in a group, it should never go through the part of the code path that does privilege things.
I'm worried about like we put some logic in either the privileged builder or the unprivileged builder, and just purely as like as a potential for introducing bugs. It applies in one case and the other case without sort of clean separation between the two. But as long as there's really sufficient separation at the library level, then I'm not going to block. Emily, if you feel strongly that it really should, it's too complicated to have an interface where the platform decides what binary to invoke. Then I think I'm definitely willing to compromise on it being one binary. But if you have information on how we're like, I know we talked about this a long time ago,
easier for
the privilege
platform authors to have one binary, especially because most of the inputs are the same, and it just makes sense on some level.
Yeah, and I feel like if we can't do this, or we don't have confidence that we can do this correctly, we shouldn't have creator at all. So if we can do it for creator, we should be able to do it for this.
Well, with creator though, we're saying that you trust the code. My security worries around this come from, I expect the API to be used with build pack code that is like completely untrusted, and creator is like not safe to use with completely untrusted code.
So let's make builder exactly like creator, where you can do it either way. Like there's a builder, like a top level builder, and that's sort of the one that is the default that you go to, and it just does everything. But we can generate 2 other binaries that are like root builder or like privileged builder and unprivileged builder or something like that. And then like you just ignore those unless you're like power user who wants to be like, nope, not running Stackpacks.
We could have have always essentially. You could make one that does this, runs this. Yeah, I think that's, I still, although not very strongly, like the separate binaries that do one, feels very Unixy, I guess, have separate binaries that just do exactly one thing. But if, it would make me feel better if there was a binary that could just be the builder, and then a binary that did the root thing, and then without having to invoke the other binary could also execute the same logic as in that builder. That feels better than not having that other binary that doesn't have the other stuff as an option at all, right? But again, not super strongly opinionated at this point, as long as there's really clean separation at the library level.
We can just be really explicit about what the security concerns are when you're talking about running untrusted Buildpack code as root. Like for other phases that we have trusted and untrusted configurations for, that makes a lot of sense to me, because there are sensitive things like access to the Docker daemon socket or the registry credentials that we don't want to provide in an untrusted situation or to like an untrusted lifecycle. But what is the harm sort of running untrusted Buildpack code as root when it's not like a privileged root, it's just a regular root?
I think there are some usability concerns, right? With like, now you can write everywhere, but if you ignore that and just focus on the security thing, there are some in container exploits that are easier if you're local root, right? Especially if you're not mapping. I mean, if you're mapping in container root to another user, then it's not so bad. But there are capabilities that if you accidentally grant to the container, you can't do much with if you're a normal user, but you can do, if you have netadmin, right? You can do some pretty crazy things as this root. It's definitely, if every other thing is set up perfectly great, right? It's not a problem. And many Dockerfile builds, Conoco I think executes as root, right, in the container. So we're definitely being very paranoid about it. But given that this is sort of a thing we're designing for really large platforms to run lots of untrusted code where, every third build pack is a cryptocurrency miner, right? I want to be very careful about not having any privileges in places where we don't need them, if that makes sense. But again, like, I agree with the single binary. I don't have a strong argument against the single binary mode that drops privileges, as long as we're sure that it dropped privileges.
I'm going to keep doing that in the proof of concept, and then I think we can dig into it in the code. Like take a look at, like I definitely need to make the library separation, and then we'll take a look at what the binary looks like. I might actually push it up a layer from where it is so that it is very much like creator, and then we'll just see if that meets your expectations or makes you happy.
I had a question. I just forgot. Oh well, never mind. That sounds good. I think I'm really interested to see what it looks like when it's sort of, you have a separate root build pack builder, in the library, and then you have a binary that invokes that separately and then drops privileges.
So the next 7 minutes, can we find what makes sense?
I'd like to, but I don't want to move on too quickly. If Joe, I want to make sure.
I think this is perfect. I'm good.
So I'm willing to compromise on this. I don't want to lose any functionality we have already as part of the RFC. Like, my intent here isn't completely refactor mixins. It's just get it to a point where you can use it with Stackpacks, with application mixins.
I want to propose that run : mixin name, the delta of changes on the run image should be exactly the same as if just mixin name was on the run image. I think we use it to sometimes mean a slightly different set of changes that don't correspond to a paired set on build or something like that. I feel like if you want a slightly different set of changes, you should just have to have a different name for it. And therefore, run : name should describe the same thing name does in the context of a single image.
Okay, how about I say done? Let's do that. I think it makes the mixin contract a lot less powerful, but I don't have good use cases for, that was the first like thread in the RFC.
It doesn't change you. You can always define a different set of things. You just have to give it a different name, which I think makes things easier to understand.
There's some weird cases. Like I'm going to give you an example, but I'm not pushing back on that change. Or like, let's just do that. Because I think in the case of Ubuntu packages, it's not going to matter that much because a package name literally means install this package. But there's some cases like, you mentioned, well, if you want the dev package, you just get the dev package. If you want the not dev package, you get the not dev package. But the dev package actually installs the not dev package, right? And so having the dev package is build only and having the regular package is not build only, you'd see those on the images, and the regular package would imply the contract across the stack. So it's not, there are some cases where like it's convenient to be able to say, this mixin represents the run portion of this with no expectation that it's not in the build portion. But in the context of a stack pack receiving the mixin names, which is the only place this matters, it's not going to matter for Ubuntu packages because in the end, stack pack just needs to, it's already on that image, it just needs to install the package. And because we don't have a wide use of mixins outside of packages, I am okay relaxing that restriction in the mixin contract. The next
I think what you're saying about certain things implying requirements of the other image is still true, and I'm not arguing with that. I just don't think that the name should describe a different set of changes within the run context or a build context. It's like it can mean different things in build than it means in run. But I think run : on a run image shouldn't mean something different than the name on a run image.
Okay, done. And that means that Stackpacks receive unprefixed information. And okay, I will make the change to the RFC this week. The next discussion is what I was more worried about, or the thread under that we had, which is in the stack definition, we still need the prefixes in order to imply the contract between the stacks. And I thought you were saying you wanted to drop that, and that's the thing I was most worried about because that'd be a really big breaking change.
I'm on the fence about dropping that. I feel like, yes, if a certain package exists on the build image, there are things that can be built on that image that then put requirements in order for them to run successfully on the run image. Like, I agree with you that there is a contract between the images when you have a particular mixin. I guess my question was, does that contract matter if the mixin isn't used by any build packs? Like, can you let the fact that a build pack needs a mixin and it hasn't prefixed it describe all parts of the contract?
No, because you don't know what the application is going to use. The mixins that the build pack specifies are just mixins that the build pack needs. If you have a Ruby build pack, you might require libyaml because Ruby needs libyaml. But if you're building a Ruby app and it needs ImageMagick and you build it with ImageMagick dev on the build image and ImageMagick isn't on the run image, then you're in for a completely great looking build experience that doesn't fail to launch with a very that fails to launch with a very surprising error message. If you want to, if as a stack author, you want to say that all your mixins have build : on the build image and run : on the run image, you can implement exactly the API you want, which is it just doesn't matter at all, right? The first change we talked about will allow that, where it wasn't allowed before because the mixins didn't. I mean, the RFC in general will allow that because having build : package name and run : package name on the different images now satisfies just package name coming from the build pack. And so I think if we just relax that first restriction you talked about, then we have all the functionality, and you can still imply a contract between the images if you want to, but it's totally optional.
In the case you're talking about where an app needs ImageMagick, there's a mixin requirement that nobody has expressed, right? So you could try to build that on a build image that doesn't have ImageMagick, and you won't find out until it fails. But what you're saying is if it succeeds, it should keep succeeding.
Yep. The user has decided to use that mixin by selecting a stack image that has it. Or eventually you could say the user could put something in Project Toml that gets sent to the mixins requirement, and then the mixin gets installed automatically, right? But I don't think that's always the case.
Yeah, I want to think about that more, but I don't need to push it now because it is a big change and seems like it's got risky edges.
Are you okay?
Yes, I concede. I can see the
Okay, with just getting the RFC through with application makes sense.
Done.
We'll take your thing for the
Horse
first one, I think for the
trade.
second thing.
Yeah.
Go. Okay, awesome, perfect. So then, Joe, I think we're unblocked on the mixin interface, and Stackpacks can just receive unstage specified. The unstage specified is kind of key here for your RFC package names, and just wrap them straight to apt-get install, and it should be really clean.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm gonna have to drop. The only two things that we didn't get to actually, I think, are can Stackpacks write to the BOM and what's the working directory? And I think they should be able to modify the BOM, but I don't care about the working directory.
BOM seems okay with. I have to think about that because of the replay stuff is weird, but there should be some way to write metadata for sure.
Okay, yeah, think about it. It's not a blocker, so.
Yeah.
I feel like for now we could do a naive they add to the BOM, but I wonder if someday we actually want stacks to come with bombs, and then this adds to the stack BOM, you know?
The build one should add to the report. The run one should add to the BOM.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're both bombs, the build BOM and the
Build BOM and
BOM. Yeah.
But it's not a bill of materials. It's a bill of tools that were used to generate the, I don't know.
It's a bill of materials for an ephemeral thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think most secure teams would differentiate. All right, so I'll update the RC with this, and then I'll keep working on the POC.
Cool.
All right.
Awesome. Let me know if you help or tag me on GitHub if I can. Cool.
Cool. Will do. Bye.